Welcome back to Sacred Arc, a podcast about life, loss, and the soul in between. I'm Kimberley, intuitive grief guide, death doula, licensed esthetician, and whether I wanted to be or not, a lifelong student of grief. There are some losses that change your life emotionally, and then there are losses that change the entire structure of your life. Losing a partner, a spouse, someone you built your everyday life around is one of those losses. Because this isn't only the loss of a person, it's the loss of a witness to your life. The person who knew your routines, your habits, your moods, your history. The person who existed inside the ordinary parts of your life so consistently that their presence became woven into your sense of identity. And I think that's part of what makes partner loss feel so disorienting. Because when someone is deeply integrated into your life, their absence doesn't only show up emotionally. It shows up everywhere. In the silence of the house, in the empty side of the bed, in the moments where your brain still instinctively expects them to walk through the door. And sometimes people don't realize how physically grief can be felt when the person you lost was part of your everyday environment. There are people who shared decades with someone, entire adult lives, raising children together, paying bills together, building routines together. And when that person dies, there can be this overwhelming feeling of, who am I now, inside of a life that was built with someone else? And even in relationships that weren't perfect, there is still an enormous shift. Because grief doesn't only exist around perfection. It exists around attachment, connection, history, shared life. And when that shared life suddenly changes, it can feel like your entire nervous system is trying to understand a reality that it wasn't prepared for. I think one of the reasons partner loss can feel so difficult to explain is because people often reduce grief to sadness. But this kind of grief is so much bigger than sadness. It can feel like disorientation, like your internal compass stopped working, because so much of adulthood becomes interconnected with another person, your schedule, your routines, your future decisions, your emotional regulation, even your sense of identity sometimes. And when that person is gone, there can be this strange feeling of moving through life while parts of your brain still believes they should be there. You might still reach for your phone to text them, hear something funny, and instinctively turn to tell them. Wake up for a split second forgetting they're gone, or walk into a room expecting their presence. And those moments can feel brutal because grief often lives inside instinct, inside habit, inside muscle memory. And I think people outside of this experience sometimes underestimate how many parts of life become attached to a partner over time, especially long-term relationships. There are routines and roles that quietly form over years, sometimes without even realizing it. Who cooks dinner? Who drives? Who remembers birthdays? Who handles stress in certain situations? And after loss, even small tasks can suddenly feel emotionally loaded because everything becomes a reminder that the structure of your life changed. And something else that deserves acknowledgement is how lonely this grief can feel. Not only emotionally, but practically, physically, spiritually, because this is often the person you shared your private world with, and when they're gone, there can be this deep feeling of no longer having the same place to put your thoughts, your worries, your joy, your daily experiences, and that absence can echo through almost every part of your life. I think one of the most painful parts of partner loss is grieving the future at the same time. Because when we love someone deeply, we naturally begin building futures with them, sometimes consciously, sometimes quietly. It's the trips you planned, the holidays you imagined, the routines you thought would continue for years, the idea of growing old together, even simple things, future conversations, future mornings, future anniversaries, future versions of life that existed in your mind without needing to be spoken out loud every day. And when someone dies, those futures disappear too. And that kind of grief can feel incredibly destabilizing because you're not only grieving what existed, you're grieving what you believed was still coming. I think that's why partner loss can create such a profound identity shift, because suddenly the future you emotionally organized your life around is no longer there. Now there's this painful process of trying to imagine life differently when your heart was still attached to the life you thought you would have. And sometimes people around grieving partners don't fully understand this part because they focus on helping someone survive the immediate loss without realizing the person is also grieving retirement plans, future trips, future holidays, shared dreams, the comfort of imagined stability. And those losses are real too, even though they never fully happened. There's also something deeply painful about watching life continue moving forward when the future you imagined stopped. Seeing other couples, watching anniversaries pass, watching people continue building lives while yours feels fractured. And that can create another layer of grief entirely, not jealousy necessarily, but awareness. Awareness of what changed, awareness of what's missing, awareness of the life that no longer exists in the way that you thought it would. And I think part of healing after partner loss is slowly learning how to exist inside a future you never expected to have. Not replacing the person, not forgetting the relationship, but slowly allowing yourself to reconnect to life while still carrying love for someone who shaped it so deeply. Partner loss can feel incredibly isolating. And I think part of that isolation comes from the fact that even when people love and support you, they still go home to their own lives. Their routines continue, their relationships continue, their sense of normal eventually returns, but yours may not, at least not in the same way. And after the initial shock passes, after the funeral, the flowers, the messages, the check-ins, there's often this quieter phase of grief that people don't talk about enough. The phase where support slowly fades, but the reality of the loss becomes even more real. Because in the beginning, sometimes the shock protects you. There are people around, tasks to handle, things to organize, but eventually the silence settles in. That's often when the loneliness becomes most noticeable. I think there's also something uniquely isolating about losing the person who knew your private world. The person who witnessed your everyday life, the person you vented to after hard days. The person who knew your routines, your moods, your habits, your stories. And when that person is gone, it can feel like part of your emotional home disappeared too. And even when people genuinely care, they may not fully understand the depth of how much changes after partner loss. Because grief after losing a spouse or a partner isn't only emotional, it's logistical, financial, physical, relational. Your entire life structure changes at once, and trying to carry all of that while also grieving can feel overwhelming. There's also pressure, sometimes spoken or unspoken, to eventually move forward, and I say that in quotations, to socialize again, to date again, to stop talking about the person as much, and that pressure can make grieving people feel even more alone, because grief doesn't disappear just because time passes. Especially when the relationship shaped so much of your everyday existence. And sometimes people stop bringing the person up because they're afraid of making you sad, without realizing you're already thinking about them constantly anyways. And often what grieving people want most is not avoidance, it's acknowledgement. It's permission to continue loving someone openly even after they're gone. I also think it's incredibly important to talk about the fact that not every relationship is simple. And grief can become very complicated when love existed alongside pain. Because real relationships are layered. There can be deep love, history, connection, shared life, and also conflict, resentment, betrayal, unfinished conversations, things that never got repaired. And when someone dies, those unresolved pieces don't automatically disappear. Sometimes they become louder. Because death removes the possibility of future resolution, future conversations, future apologies, future understanding. And that can create a grief that feels emotionally confusing. You may grieve who the person was while also grieving what the relationship never became. And both can exist at the same time. I think people sometimes feel ashamed of this kind of grief, especially if the relationship was difficult. Because society often wants grief to look clean and uncomplicated, but many relationships aren't that way, especially long-term ones. And loving someone does not mean there was never pain. It doesn't mean everything was healthy. It doesn't mean there weren't wounds. And sometimes grief after complicated relationships can bring up guilt too, regret. Questions like, did I do enough? Could things have been different? Why didn't we fix this? Or why am I grieving someone who also hurt me? And those questions can feel incredibly heavy to carry. But I think part of healing is allowing complexity to exist without judging yourself for it. Because grief is not a measure of perfection. It's a reflection of attachment, of connection, of emotional significance. And relationships can be meaningful even when they were imperfect. Sometimes grief isn't only mourning the person, sometimes it's mourning that hope you still carried, the version of the relationship you wanted, the healing that never happened, or the future reconciliation that never came. And that kind of grief deserves compassion too. I think one of the hardest parts of partner loss is the everyday absence. Because grief doesn't only show up during major milestones or anniversaries. It shows up in the ordinary moments, the quiet moments, the moments no one else sees. Cooking dinner alone, hearing a song and immediately thinking of them. Walking through a grocery store buying different amounts of food now. Those small moments can feel incredibly painful because they happen constantly. And I think that's part of why partner grief can feel ongoing in such an intense way. Because the relationship existed inside routine, inside daily life, so the reminders live there too. Not only emotionally, but physically. Your nervous system became accustomed to another person's presence, their voice, their footsteps, their energy in shared spaces. And when that suddenly changes, your body notices, even before your mind sometimes. There can also be this strange experience of continuing to think in we for a long time, making decisions mentally, including them. Imagining, telling them things, feeling connected to them in your internal world even after they're gone. And that's not abnormal. That's attachment. That's love continuing to exist. I think people underestimate how deeply everyday companionship shapes us. Not only the big moments, but the repeated ordinary ones, morning coffee, small conversations, shared glances, inside jokes, simple routines. Those are often the things people miss the most. Because those moments quietly become the fabric of a shared life. And after loss, there can be this painful process of learning how to move through ordinary life differently. Not because you stop loving the person, but because life keeps asking you to continue existing inside spaces that now feel unfamiliar. And that takes an incredible amount of emotional energy that other people often can't see. When it comes to partner loss, I don't think healing is about getting over someone. And honestly, I think that phrase can feel incredibly painful to grieving people. Because when someone was deeply woven into your life, you don't simply move past them. You learn how to carry the love, the grief, and the absence differently over time. And that process looks different for everyone. What helps one person may not help another. And I think that's important to say because grief advice can sometimes feel overwhelming. People want to fix pain. They want to make things better, but grief often isn't something that gets fixed. It's something that slowly gets integrated into your life experience. For some people, what helps is talking about the person, keeping their memory present, saying their name, telling stories, allowing the relationship to continue existing emotionally instead of feeling pressured to lock it away. For others, what helps is structure, routine, getting through the day one small thing at a time. Making coffee, walking the dog, going outside. Simple things that remind the nervous system that life is still happening even while grief exists. And sometimes what helps is finding spaces where grief doesn't have to be hidden, where you don't have to pretend you're okay, where you don't feel pressured to be positive before you're emotionally ready. Because one of the hardest parts of grief can be feeling like your pain makes other people uncomfortable. And that can create even more isolation. I also think it helps when grieving people stop fighting their grief constantly. Not giving up on life, but stopping the internal war of I shouldn't feel this way. Because grief after deep love often comes in waves, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes years later. And healing doesn't mean those waves never come again. It means you slowly become more able to survive them when they do. And honestly, sometimes what helps most is compassion, real compassion. The kind that allows someone to be exactly where they are emotionally without trying to rush them somewhere else. Because grief changes people, especially partner loss. And healing is often less about returning to who you were before and more about learning how to exist honestly inside of who you are now. If you're listening to this while carrying partner loss, I really want you to hear this. There is no correct timeline for grief. There is no moment where you suddenly become done grieving someone who is deeply intertwined with your life. And there is nothing wrong with you if certain days still feel incredibly heavy. I think people sometimes expect grief to move in a straight line, like after enough time passes, you should feel normal again. But grief is not linear, and love doesn't disappear on a schedule. Some days you might feel functional, even hopeful, and other days something small can bring the grief rushing back unexpectedly. A song, a smell, an anniversary, a memory, an empty seat. And none of that means you're failing at healing. It means attachment leaves an imprint. You are allowed to miss them. You are allowed to still love them. You are allowed to feel angry, relieved, lonely, confused, numb, or broken open. Some moments may even hold joy and grief at the same time, and all of that can exist together. And even if your relationship was complicated, you are also allowed to grieve in complicated ways. You do not have to justify your pain. You do not have to explain why the loss affects you deeply. Love and hurt can coexist. And grief is often far more emotionally layered than people realize from the outside. You are also allowed to protect yourself emotionally while grieving, to rest, to step back from people, to move slowly, to say no, to not have answers yet. Because grief is exhausting, not only emotionally, but physically and mentally too. And surviving loss takes enormous energy, even when nobody else can see it. Before we close today, I want to invite you for a second to just close your eyes, settle into your body. If this podcast today brought up any emotions in you that you've been struggling with, I want you to know you're not alone. And if it feels okay, I want you to take a slow breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. I just want to acknowledge how life-altering this kind of loss really is, because losing a partner often means rebuilding life while carrying heartbreak at the same time. And that is an incredibly difficult thing for a human being to do. There are people listening to this who are learning how to sleep alone, eat alone, parent alone, make decisions alone, move through ordinary life without the person who used to stand beside them in it. And I think that deserves far more compassion than our culture often gives it. Because from the outside, people may see someone functioning, working, smiling occasionally, showing up to life, but internally, they might still be carrying an enormous amount of grief every single day. And sometimes the strength required just to continue existing after profound loss is invisible to everyone except the person living in it. And if you are that person today, I hope you allow yourself compassion for the ways grief continues to show up, especially in the quiet moments, especially in the ordinary moments, because those moments often carry the deepest reminders of what love once looked like in your daily life. I also hope that you remember that healing does not mean forgetting. It does not mean replacing someone, and it does not mean your love for them mattered less. Sometimes healing simply means learning how to keep living while carrying someone's absence differently over time. I also think love leaves traces in the ways we continue caring, in the memories we carry, in the habits and tenderness and connection that remain part of us even after loss. And maybe part of the healing is allowing those traces to exist without feeling like we have to erase them to move forward. This has been Sacred Arc. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll meet you again in the space between.